a step away from starvation. The UN says famine has pushed millions of Yemenis to the brink, but can the world step in to save them? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Yemen's humanitarian crisis. It is the poorest country in the Middle East and home to the world's worst humanitarian crisis. Yemen is in serious trouble, and there is no real solution in sight. After 7 years of war, the numbers today paint a horrifying picture. 1.7 million Yemeni youth have been displaced. More than 11 million young people depend on humanitarian assistance. And almost 2.5 million children under the age of 5 are malnourished, of which nearly 400,000 are at risk of imminent death. And for those Yemenis to have any chance of survival, many argue they will need the rest of the world to intervene. Earlier this year, at a virtual donor conference, the UN appealed for $3.85 billion, but received just less than half. And on the sidelines of this year's General Assembly, the UN's humanitarian chief, Martin Griffiths, warned that unless the international community digs deeper into its pockets, more Yemenis will suffer and die.
Each month, we provide food, clean water, and other life-saving assistance to more than 10 million people. And these are important achievements, but the work is far from done. We're nowhere near the funding levels of 2019, when our appeal received $3.6 billion, almost 90% of what we required then. A number of sectors still face funding gaps. Humanitarians providing healthcare, clean water, sanitation, and shelter in these sectors have less than a fifth of what they need to fund their operations this year. And without additional funding, these and other forms of life-saving support, including food assistance, will have to be reduced in the coming weeks and months.
Well, in the wake of that meeting, $600 million more have been pledged, and the European Union has agreed to double its assistance to $140 million. But it's still not enough to prevent further tragedy. There's still a funding shortfall of $1 billion. The reality is the only way to end this crisis is to end the conflict itself. Now, here's a reminder of how it all started. Now, the war in Yemen has its roots in the Arab Spring. When President Ali Abdullah Saleh was forced from power in 2012, his deputy, Abdurrabbu Mansur Hadi, took over. He was tasked with bringing stability to Yemen, but as he failed, many in the country ran out of patience. So in 2014, Houthi rebels linked to Iran rebelled against Hadi's Sunni government. They took over the capital, Sana'a, forcing the president to flee. But in 2015, a Saudi-led coalition joined the fight. Riyadh was desperate to restore Hadi to power, and backed by the logistical support of the US, UK, and France, the Saudis began an aerial bombing campaign that caused catastrophic damage. And as a result of the conflict, much of it between proxy powers, millions of Yemenis continue to suffer. To tell us more about what really is happening on the ground in Yemen, I'm joined from Sana'a by Sultana Begum, the Norwegian Refugee Council Advocacy Manager in Yemen. Sultana, thanks so much for being with us. You know, back in February, with US President Joe Biden stopping the sale of weapons to Saudi, we were all talking about diplomatic breakthroughs in Yemen that so many hoped would finally ease the humanitarian suffering. Yet here we are. We're still calling it the worst humanitarian crisis on the planet. Just how bad is it right now?
Unfortunately, I don't have much optimism coming from Yemen at the moment. Currently, we see the conflict escalating, the epicenter being Marib, but also in Taiz, Hodeidah, and elsewhere. The economic situation in the country is unbearable. What we're seeing in parts of the country is power cuts. Food prices are double what they were before the conflict, the price of vegetables, the price of water, all these basics that people need to survive are just beyond people's reach. So when we talk to people, they say they've hit their limits. And then currently the country is also experiencing a third wave of COVID-19. So we're seeing the numbers increasing. And we know that Yemen's health health services have been really battered by the conflict, and so this is making the situation increasingly worrying.
Has anything, any sector, improved at all?
I think since the last donor conference in March this year, we did see more money coming in from international governments. And what that money has done is kept people's heads above the water. We were talking about the worst famine in 40 years. So what that money has done is pull people back from the brink, and that's what the pull people back from the brink. But however, having said that, the money is now running out. Humanitarian organizations need money for food assistance, for cash, but also other things like water, health services, and things like that. And we are running out of money. And without more money, we'll see thousands of people are still on the brink of starvation.
But you have, you know, on the sidelines of this UNGA presentation with Martin Griffiths, there was some additional money pledged. Overall, though, the total is still less than half of what the United Nations initially asked for. But it is still better than nothing, is it not?
I think we would really like to welcome the attention that Yemen received at the UN General Assembly this year, and we welcome world leaders. And what happened at this event was a consensus about how bad the situation in Yemen continues to be, and a consensus that we needed urgent action. So we need more money, and the 600 million that was additionally pledged at the conference, it's welcome, but it's not enough. We are still 1 billion short. What we need donors to do is urgently disperse this 600 million as quickly as possible. But we need more money, and we need more money not just for the humanitarian response, but we need money for jobs, incomes, for education and other things, because this conflict has seen the widespread destruction of society in Yemen.
Right. But Sultana, there are critics of this aid who say it doesn't provide relief, that it's diverted to corruption among agencies on the ground and actually can help perpetrate the war. And that has been a problem in other conflicts. So is it a problem in Yemen, or is the majority of aid, as you see, well distributed and well spent?
So currently in Yemen, we are reaching 10 million people every month with aid. And these are people who are at the brink, as I said. We're reaching them with food, we're reaching them with water in the middle of a pandemic. And for many people, what the conflict has done, there are no jobs, there are no salaries, the access to public services don't exist. So they're really, really reliant on the humanitarian aid that is provided. So what we're asking world leaders to do is, yes, give more money for humanitarian aid, but we also need to ensure that people can earn an income, that the economy is supported. And overall, what we need the conflict actors to do is put down their weapons and get back to the negotiating table, because the war is the root cause of driving humanitarian crisis in this country.
Okay, Sultana, one final question. I mean, you are in Sana'a, but as we know, there is this divide really between what is seen as North and South Yemen. Are you able to work in the same manner in both parts of the conflict-afflicted area, or is there more trouble now in the South than had been before?
So my organization works in 10 different governorates in the northern and southern parts of Yemen. I think the current situation in the south, the deteriorating economic situation, the lack of public services, the lack of salaries, and the insecurity, it's really affecting civilians in the country. So what we would really need to see is implementation of the Riyadh agreement. We need to see services provided to the people of Yemen in the south, but across the country. Currently, we are still able to access many parts of the country. We're able to provide the assistance that people need, but we are worried about the situation in the southern areas and other parts of the country.
Okay. Sultana, I will have to leave it there. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us on the Newsmakers. It's greatly appreciated. Let's broaden out the discussion now and bring in three new panelists. From Sana'a is pro-Houthi journalist Hussain Albukhaiti. Elisabeth Kendall joins us from London. She's a senior research fellow in Oriental Studies at Pembroke College, Oxford. She's also been involved in educational projects in Yemen. And also from the British capital is Baraa Shiban, a Yemeni political analyst and a caseworker for human rights organization Reprieve. Thanks all so much for being with us. Elisabeth, let me start with you. I just want to get your take on how much this beneficial, really, you think this aid money is that's been pledged so far. I mean, as we noted, it is less than half than what was originally asked for. But how much do you think it can actually ease suffering?
Well, of course, aid money is incredibly welcome when the situation in Yemen is so dire. As your previous guest said, there are about over 20 million people who desperately need assistance. But all right, we're still going to be about $1 billion short of the target that's required just to keep people alive in Yemen. And ultimately, I think we all need to remember that aid money, it's a bit like a Band-Aid. It's really, really important, but it's not a fix for Yemen. Ultimately, there needs to be a much greater political will, not just internationally, but amongst the domestic political players as well, to fix the Yemen crisis permanently. There need to be talks.
Right.
There needs to be a ceasefire. And the aid can only ever go so far.
Right. We've been saying that for so many months now. And Hussain, as Elisabeth was saying, it's a Band-Aid. It helps, but it doesn't fix the problem. However, you actually believe the answer to Yemen's humanitarian crisis does not come from aid at all, because most of it, you feel, is pilfered and diverted away from the people it's actually supposed to help. So tell us, in the case of Yemen, who's taking it and why does it hurt Yemenis?
I mean, I think it's clear that the United Nations organization and other NGOs, they are actually profiting from the war on Yemen. They become like a warlord who making huge amount of profit. If you can see the salaries of managers or of field managers here in Yemen, they can reach tens of thousands of dollars. And as well that the United Nations, some of their project in Yemen, as an example, if the Saudi will bomb a water well, the United Nations is not gonna go to build or to fix that water well. They will just try to buy water from some area and distribute that water in that area that that's in need of water. They show you that they actually don't invest monies in Yemen infrastructure or in what exactly people need in Yemen. And we have heard many times that they have collected many millions, but still the situation in Yemen, it has not changed. But I can say that if the United Nations and the international community want to end what's happening in Yemen, they just could stop the war and lift the blockade, and then salaries must be paid. Just imagine a handful of people who so-called had legitimacy. They are in Riyadh, in Riyadh's hotels, and they control Yemen income. That's why I think they have the international community must pinpoint the main reason of this situation in Yemen.
Okay, but Hussain, very quickly, I mean, you can complain about whatever inefficiencies you think there are in aid work, but still, you have to concede that the aid work that takes place in Yemen saves lives. Without it, millions more would potentially die.
I mean, of course, I mean, no one can deny that. But I mean, what I'm saying that instead of all that, instead of collecting monies in the name of Yemenis, I mean, many people depend on that. Why the international community and the UN, they must pressure Saudi Arabia to stop its war. They must pressure Saudi Arabia to lift the blockade. And then Yemenis are hard working. They could just get well and find jobs and look. I mean, as an example, the blockade on Yemen has actually destroyed the entire fishing industry. Saudi bombardment and cluster bomb in north of Yemen has actually damaged the farming industry. That's why those millions of people who are actually now in need of this aid, they are in need of this aid because Saudi Arabia has cut the salaries, because Saudi Arabia has bombed their jobs. That's why I think United Nations will still keep collecting money for Yemen for many,
Okay.
many years if the Saudi will not stop the war against Yemen.
Okay, Baraa, do you agree at all there that the international community is, according to Hussain, going about it the wrong way by focusing on aid and getting humanitarian relief into the country? And he's saying that it's actually a profitable industry for them rather than going about addressing the actual causes of the war and the blockade, which he says is Saudi imposed and what is really hurting the country.
Well, I mean, I agree on the point that actually the Yemeni nation cannot rely and survive just on aid money. There hasn't been, I think, any country that can survive just based on humanitarian conferences, pledges from the international community and INGOs doing the role of the state. At the end of the day, when it comes down to it, the war, especially the civil war, needs to come to an end. So basically, the Yemeni leaders need to step up and say enough is enough, and try to find a political solution to end the conflict. Now, I know Hussain likes to so much blame the one side of the conflict. There are many sides to it. One important factor is, of course, what Elisabeth and Hussain are very familiar with, which is the government, the internationally recognized government, needs to be present on the ground. And the Riyadh agreement hasn't been implemented due to the lack of agreement, especially between Saudis and the United Arab Emirates. The second factor, which is important, the Houthis are on the offense. So while he's blaming Saudi Arabia, let's not forget that David Beasley is the one who accused the Houthis of diverting aid. And the escalation on Marib, on Shabwa, that's done by the Houthis. That's not done by the other side. And the third and most important thing, I think, is the war, which is the civil war that started in September, needs to come to an end. So we have an international community that is disengaging constantly from the conflict and saying we're trying to find a solution for the conflict, but there hasn't been any concrete steps to find, for example, a lasting ceasefire or finding a solution to the ongoing conflict on a day-to-day basis.
Right.
And I think all of these, matters coming together makes it hard for just a humanitarian aid conference to really resolve the problem in Yemen.
You know, Elisabeth, we've been saying for years now that Yemen is, home to the world's worst humanitarian crisis, but that still has not made it a true priority for the international community, especially since it seems they've managed to limit the spillover. So where does Yemen actually fall now with this humanitarian crisis on the international community's list of need?
Well, that's a really important question that you've raised, because one of the reasons why this war keeps dragging on and on, there are many reasons, but one of them is that it's just not getting the high priority, sustained international interest to try to figure out sustained solutions. It's a question of, okay, things get really bad, we throw some aid money at it and hope that this assuages our consciences. But there are several reasons for why it's not really going any further. Firstly, it's very complicated. It's a very complicated war. It's not easy to identify good guys and bad guys. There are no clear good guys and bad guys. There are no quick wins. There's no easy to follow storyline. And it doesn't have significant oil resources. And we're not seeing Yemenis show up in places like Europe, unlike the Syrian crisis. So there are lots of displaced people, lots of displaced Yemenis, 4 million of them, but they're inside Yemen. And meanwhile, the international community just sort of tiptoes around the agendas of its regional allies, the UAE, Saudi Arabia. And so, I just think that other more urgent priorities keep taking over. There's China and trade, there's Iran and the nuclear talks, there's the jihad moving to Africa, there's other humanitarian crises like in Tigray, now Afghanistan. So Yemen just keeps getting shunted off the agenda.
And as you were saying, I mean, Elisabeth, nobody wants to have, their hands dirtied by potentially taking the wrong side in this conflict. But in the meantime, there is one clearly identifiable wrong side that is actually very rarely addressed now, unfortunately, and that is the forces of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and the local Daesh affiliate in the south of Yemen. If the international community kind of wants to stay out of this, are they, in essence, allowing a breeding ground to further build for these organizations that are internationally a threat to everybody?
Well, there are a couple of issues to unpack there. First of all, definitely, if the war is allowed to drag on, if the kinds of meetings that are happening on the sidelines are not a lot more inclusive, then yes, we are going to have a continuing breeding ground for militants, jihadi, terrorist activities. But the second issue is that the groups you've just mentioned, Daesh and Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, they are not the same groups that they were even 3 or 4 years ago. These groups have changed. They've come under a lot of pressure. So what's happened is that they've started to morph into other militias. They've started to blend into different mainstream militias. Different splinters have gone different ways and are being instrumentalized in the overall conflict. So just to sum up, it's now not at all easy to define what or who is a terrorist in Yemen. And that's making everything a whole lot more complicated.
Hussain Albukhaiti, I know your connection dropped at one point, but I want to give you a chance to comment on what we just spoke about, and that is the issue of the militants of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, as well as the local Daesh affiliate that is in the south. They both have been becoming increasingly active from what we've heard from a number of analysts that have seen the situation there. How much does it concern you, their presence in your country, and how much it confounds a conflict that people are trying desperately to find a solution for, but this will add another element of complication to it?
I believe that the existence of Al-Qaeda in Yemen, it concerns every Yemenis. But I can assure you that in areas under the control of Sana'a, Al-Qaeda and ISIS has been eliminated, 100% eliminated. And there is no more attack, no existence of Al-Qaeda in those areas. And now main areas that for Al-Qaeda is in Abiyan, in some areas in Ma'rib and other parts of south and east of Yemen, and they show you that the war on Yemen actually and has actually made a great safe haven for Al-Qaeda in this area under the control of the so-called Saudi-backed forces. And I just want to add, just to have a comment about Mr. Baraa Shiban when he have put the blame on the situation like on the Houthi and as well on Hadi government when he said that they should be on the ground, but he hasn't mentioned Saudi Arabia, hasn't mentioned United Arab Emirates. Just imagine a coalition made from the most richest country like Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates and supported by the most powerful country like United Kingdom and United States, and still the situation in the south is so bad that a dollar in the south is 1,100 riyal, but in area under the control of Sana'a, $1 is 600 riyal. And they show you that the spread of Al-Qaeda, the corruption, the insecurity in south of Yemen is all because Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, they want to divide Yemen.
Okay. Baraa, I saw you laughing at several points, not least at the beginning when he was talking about the situation with Daesh and Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and then later when he put forth the Houthis' perspective on how the country fares under control of one side or the other. Do go ahead.
What really baffles me is that the Houthis, right before even the coalition started, right before even Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates even started, we were demanding, I was in Sana'a, and we were demanding from the Houthi leadership not to fight across the country and come to the negotiating table so we can find a political solution, so we can move towards elections. Do you know what they said? They said, no, we're going to fight Al-Qaeda. I find it amazing that even after all of these years, there isn't even a sense of recognition that that was a mistake, that you need to come together with the other Yemenis and not accuse the others of being Al-Qaeda and Daesh affiliates. They were accusing people like me of being Al-Qaeda and Daesh affiliates when we were still in Sana'a. The second thing, when he talks about the deteriorating economic situation, he forgets to mention the public sector in the Houthi-controlled areas having been paid for more than 3 years, despite them collecting customs, despite them taxing people and adding additional taxes that does not exist in the Yemeni Yemeni financial regulation. They haven't been paying a single dime to the salaries of the public employees, the people who work in the areas they control. And the third and very important,
85% of Yemeni budget was to come from oil and gas, Mr. Baraa
Hussain,
Shiban.
unfortunately, I can't actually give you time to respond there. We just have 30 seconds left, and I just want Elisabeth very closely. I mean, hearing both sides there between your fellow panelists, I mean, how could there be a common ground then found for a resolution here? Very quickly.
Well, I think finding common ground is not going to be quick. And both of my colleagues here are right in some respect. Everybody's to blame, and the international community as well, all sides. So perhaps what I would say is that there needs to be a whole new approach, that actually just carrying on with the same old elites, the same old interlocutors is not going to work. We need to have a much more inclusive approach to peace.
Okay, Elisabeth, I will have to give you the final word. We are completely out of time for this edition of The Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists sincerely so much for joining us. To our viewers for tuning in as well, remember you can follow us on Twitter at @the_newsmakers, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.